Okay, number one, the first two questions should not be new. What's the amplitude?
1.
So that tells me I'm going to go up 1 and down 1. How do I find the period? 2 pi divided by 1, so it's just 2 pi. New part today, phase shift. The phase shift is going to be the opposite of C. What's the opposite of C right now? Positive 3 pi over 2 divided by B. In this case, B is just 1, so it's just going to be 3 pi over 2. Good so far?
No. What did you do?
Negative C over B.
No, but it says,
Okay.
I don't get it because the equation already has a negative.
But you always do the opposite because it's inside parentheses. So since it's a minus sign, you're going to change it to a plus sign. It's always going to be the opposite of what you see. That's when you're inside parentheses, you got to do the opposite sign. So to figure out what my intervals are going to be, the first thing I need to do is figure out what I'm going to increase by. Do you remember yesterday we took our period, which tells us the whole stretch, and we have to divide it into 4 pieces, don't we? So divide this by 4. That's going to give you how much you're increasing by. That's our increment right now.
Oh, so wait, we always divide by?
You always divide by 4 because you're splitting the graph into 4 pieces, so we can get our 5 different spots. And now I fill in my intervals. Here's what's different today. This value, 3 pi over 2, is where you're starting. And now you're going to increase by how much? You're going to increase by pi over 2. You're adding pi over 2 on for each spot. So this is going to be 4 pi over 2. Add on pi over 2 again. We get 5 pi over 2. 6 pi over 2. 7 pi over 2. That value that you're increasing by is how much you have to make each tick mark on your graph now. So you're not just going to start your tick marks at 3 pi over 2 because there's spaces in between there. You have to make sure each space is the same amount. So this is actually what you're going to start the x-axis at.
So when you subtracted the pi over 2, what did you get?
I didn't subtract pi over 2. I added it. I added it on for each spot you're adding on. That's your increment. That's how much you increase by. Because if I look at, guys, if you look at the stopping value and the starting value, this is how you can check. If I subtract those two, you should be getting your period. So if I subtract those two, I'm going to get 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. From where I start to where I stop should end up spanning out to be the whole period. So now I'm going to start the x-axis at pi over 2. Alright, so we're going to go up by pi over 2 for each one. So we actually have 2 spots in here that aren't included in our list of values, but so that every spot is the same amount of space, you have to fill those in. Those are like our empty space holders until we get out there.
So you start with the interval?
You just have to make sure, because you can't start here. You can't say, I'm going to start at 3 pi over 2 and then I'm going to have 4 pi over 2 next, because then you'd have different spaces here. You have to have the same amount of space going through your whole graph.
Okay.
So we're starting with that interval for this problem. They're a little different as we go throughout. It gets a little complicated. All right, so now when we go to graph it, we know sine starts at the intercept, because sine has an I in it, right? But the intercept is going to start at that first value that we said it's going to start at. That the phase shift is where it starts at. So you're going to start with an intercept on 3 pi over 2, and then the max is at 4 pi over 2. The min is at 5 pi over, or the intercept is at 5 pi over 2. Then min, then intercept.
Oh, I ain't slept all week. Marion.
Number 2, what's the amplitude?
1.
How am I going to find the period?
2 pi over
2 pi over b, which is 1, so it's 2 pi. And then the new part today, phase shift, is going to be
negative c over
Negative pi over 4 over 1, which is negative pi over 4. How much am I going to increase by?
Pi.
pi over
2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. But look at what's going to happen here in just a second. My starting value is negative pi over 4, right?
Yeah.
But I'm trying to increase by pi over 2. Is that going to be real easy to add?
No.
Yeah.
So what you want to make sure happens here is you want to make sure when you look at these that you actually get a common denominator. When I look at those two things, what's the common denominator of those?
4.
Isn't the common denominator 4? So wouldn't it be easier if I changed this to something out of 4? If I actually went back to 2 pi over 4, isn't that going to be easier to add on?
yes.
That's what I want to add on. Use a common denominator. Make your life easy. Use a common denominator. So if I add on 2 pi over 4, I'm going to get negative pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 4. When they're negative, sometimes I got to write it out to figure it out. Isn't that just positive pi over 4?
Yes.
Add 2 pi over 4 again, we get 3 pi over 4. 5 pi over 4, and we're going to end at
7 pi over
7 pi over 4. We added 2 pi over 4 onto all of those. Does that make sense? When you go to do the x-axis value for these, if I am starting at negative pi over 4, how big is it from negative pi over 4 to 0? Because that's going to be my increment. That's going to be how much it's increasing by here. Negative pi over 4 to 0 is just pi over 4, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's how much I'm going to make each line worth. So it's pretty much, if you look at what we had here, but we're dropping that first coefficient. We're just going to use pi over 4 for the x-axis.
Can you please explain how you got the integral?
You take the period and you divide it by 4. So I took my period, which was 2 pi, and I divided it by 4. But when I divided it by 4, I got pi over 2, and then they didn't have a common denominator, which makes it very hard to add. So I went back to 2 pi over 4 because it's easier to add.
Oh.
It's easier to add them if you try and make them a common denominator. Do you see how we have to go to negative for this one?
Yes.
So you're actually going to have to put a mark on the left side here and make this negative pi over 4. And then we're going to go, our x-axis is going to go up by pi over 4s here. So it's going to be pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, until we get to that stopping point. 5 pi over 4. Oh, you printed it all out?
Okay. This one doesn't show percentages, but we can see the three of us on one page.
Okay.
This one shows percentages by teacher.
Okay. Thanks. 7 pi over 4.
I still have never seen someone.
Ooh, no, play California. Okay, great.
So where am I starting? Where am I starting?
Negative pi over
Negative pi over 4. That was my starting point. It's an intercept. And then just make sure you're watching as you go here that you hit the right spots, because we have some extra values in there. So that's my intercept. This is going to be my max. This is my intercept. This is going to be my min. This is going to be an intercept.
I don't understand why you put another mark in the front. I don't get this.
It's negative.
Because we're starting, so do you see how all of these are odd? Do you see how all of these are odd numbers, but this was an even number? I can't use this value to go up by, because then I'm not going to hit these odd values. So I actually have to use the odd version of it, which would just be pi over 4.
What does that mean?
Is that bad?
No.
I don't think so.
No, this is for attendance. This means like you were like late to class and then they never put you back in.
Truant.
So my max is going to be, guys, focus. My max is going to be at pi over 4. My intercept is going to be at 3 pi over 4.
Truly don't get this.
My min is going to be here. My max is going to be here.
You're still,
No, stop it.
You're still adding, right? Plus C4? Oh, yeah.
Wait, you
Start. Like, so it's the same order.
Apologize. The amplitude?
1.
1, negative 1. The period.
2 pi over 6, which is
This is different now because we have a b. 2 pi over 6 is going to be pi over 3. The phase shift. Negative c is going to be
Positive
positive pi over 2 divided by
C.
c, which is 6. Divided by b, which is 6.
Oh,
Negative c divided by b. That's how we get the phase shift. So we're going to have pi over 2 times 1/6, right? We can multiply by the reciprocal instead of dividing by 6.
yes.
Isn't that pi over 12?
Yes.
That's my starting point. I can fill that in. How much am I going to increase by? What do I do to the period next? To figure out all these intervals, how many spaces am I dividing pi over 3 into?
4.
You have to take the period and divide it into 4 sections. Pi over 3 divided by 4, which is really pi over 3 times 1/4. Pi over 12. Those have the same denominator, don't they? My starting point and my part I'm increasing by have the same denominator, so we just add those on. Add on a pi over 12, we're going to get 2 pi over 12. Add on another pi over 12, we get
3 pi over 12.
4 pi over 12. 5 pi over 12. And this one's really easy because the amount I increase by and the place I'm starting are the same. So that's how much the x-axis is going to go up by. For my x-axis, I'm just going to use that pi over 12. This is what I'm going to use for the x-axis.
Is that your
Increment. Increment.
Oh.
I'm going up by pi over 12 here. This one's pretty easy because they're the same. When they're the same, it's easy. It's when the increment and the starting point are different that it's going to be a little bit harder to decide what to do. So I filled those values in. And now I'm going to start on which point?
Pi over 12.
5 over 12 is the starting point, and that's my intercept. Then I'm going to do
You're going to go to your
max. Then you're going to do
interval.
intercept.
Intercept.
Then you're going to do
Minimum.
min. Then you're going to do
Intercept.
intercept.
Can you please show what the last one was supposed to look like, the graph was just.
Are you posting these notes?
I think I did.
I'm going to post the notes.